Well, welcome back to the kitchen, and today we're doing a theme on the Great Irish Bake Off. Last week they did a dessert, the tart tartan, and while that's very, very tasty, very popular, in Ireland the basic apple tart is more popular. I think there's nothing as tasty as a nice, good apple tart. And I'm making it with a shortcrust pastry. Now, a lot of people have problems about making pastry. If you follow the few tips I have for you, you'll have an excellent pastry after baking. The first thing you do before you start is preheat your oven. That's very important, because for pastry making you must have everything as cold as possible and the pastry baked at a high oven temperature. Next thing you do is you put your margarine or butter into the freezer. Best to do that the night before if you can. And I've just taken that from the freezer. It's rock solid. And I'm actually going to grate it into the flour. This way you're not going to raise the temperature of the pastry. And a lot of people have kind of heavy-handed. If you use this method, you won't have any problems with your pastry. So here I have 225 grams, that's 8 ounces, of our Odlums cream plain flour. Now, you don't have to do it, but if you sieve the flour into the bowl, it does help to give a lighter pastry afterwards. So we sieve the flour in. Next you put just a little bit of flour in your hands, and I have here a grater. Now, I have a very handy grater, one that goes into a jug, but at home you can just grate the margarine or the butter directly into the flour. But I just find I get it done that bit quicker by putting a little bit of flour in my hands and just grating it through. Now, if the margarine is any way soft at all, it won't grate it just gets stuck in the grater. So what I suggest you do then is use the tips of your fingers and then chill the pastry before baking it. Now, work quickly at this, because the heat of your hand does melt the marge or the butter. So here I have 125 grams, it's 4 ounces of butter or marge, frozen in the freezer. And as I say, a few hours before making the pastry, but better still if you can do it the night before, so you have a very solid block. Then cut the block in half, if it's an 8 ounce block you have, and just with the help of a little flour, grate the marge or the butter into the bowl or directly into the flour. I just find this grater is handy to work with. So work away fairly quickly, as you see, and we're nearly down to the end. With the help then of a little extra dusting of flour, we can just rub that last bit just about through the mixture. It is very, very hard. Okay, now here we have the cold butter or marge. A little bit of flour helps to get that from the grater for you. And now add all of your grated butter or margarine. So this really couldn't be easier. Once you transferred it to the flour, now we just gently mix it round. You don't really have to put your hands in the flour at all to make pastry. And if you are rubbing the marge or butter in with the tips of your fingers, don't spend too long at it. Just get pieces of marge or butter about the size of an almond or half a walnut through the flour is sufficient. So there we have it, believe it or not. Ready now to add the water. And it's important that you gradually add your ice cold water. That's important. You want everything as cold as possible and then baked at the high oven temperature. Now, it will take approximately 150 ml or a quarter pint of of water. But as I said, add it gradually, because you can't take it out once you've put it in, but you can always add extra. Now just add sufficient water to make a nice soft dough. And you'll see I'm using a knife for this in preference to a wooden spoon or a spatula, because of course the blade in the knife is that bit cooler than a wooden spoon or a spatula would be. So all brought together now, not too dry. We don't want a hard dry pastry, but just a mixture as you see there. And there we have our pastry ready. Next stage is to lightly knead the pastry. And there are two reasons why we knead. First of all, to introduce air, and secondly, to bring the mixture together smoothly. In other words, simply to remove any cracks from the dough. So I like to just take my spatula, scoop the mixture out, or the pastry out as it is at this stage, and to knead. Unlike yeast kneading where you're using a lot of pressure, this is just lightly kneading. So you don't punch the daylights out of it, just lightly roll it basically on the flour. And there we have our pastry ready. Could that be easier? I'm going to cut that in half now, and we're going to roll out one half for the bottom layer of pastry. So we just dust the board with a little flour, take our rolling pin, and just a small amount of flour on the pin. You don't want to knock the balance of flour and margarine or fat or butter out. So you just, after every 2 or 3 light even rolls, you just lift the pastry, letting it fall back in its own time, so that any stretching which may have been done will be removed from the pastry. What I mean by that, if you stretch when you're rolling, when you throw it back down onto the board or the table like that, you don't have to worry because it springs back to its original shape. Now we just roll it out until it's large enough to cover our oven-proof dish, and I think we should have it fairly right there. We now just ease it up on the rolling pin and gently place it on the plate. Now just ease it into position as we've done there. Now a tip for anyone who has a problem with what they call in the business soggy bottoms or soggy base pastry. What I suggest you do is I'm going to do now, and that is when I'm peeling my apples and rolling the top layer of pastry, I actually put the plate with the pastry into the freezer. So we have a freezer underneath here. We're just going to pop it into the freezer for a few minutes. So now we're going to roll out the second layer, and this has to be made just ever so slightly larger than the bottom layer, because of course we're going to pile in some apples. So this has got to cover the plate and indeed the apples. Now I just put a little bit of flour over that. Here we go. Light even rolls are also important, because if you don't use light even rolls, you're actually going to stretch the pastry. So there we have it. Wonderful. Small little bit more pastry now, sorry. And you'll be able to see the pieces of marge to the dough. That's a good sign. That means as yet the marge hasn't become too soft. Now last roll here, and I think we should have it sufficiently rolled. But to leave that now for just a few seconds, because the last thing we do is peel our apples. And I use 4 small eating apples or 2 large ones as we have here for the 9-inch plate, just an ordinary oven-proof plate. Just peel the apples. I do this fairly quickly because the apples, as you know, can in fact get or go brown very quickly. So what I do, we have the bottom layer in the freezer. I just peel my apples and I actually slice them into the pastry. Now we just slice our apples in. Now don't make the apples too thick, because we want them to cook through while the pastry is baking. So there we have our thin slices of cooking apple. Now what I generally do, if I'm using the 4 small apples, I peel or slice 2 into the pastry and add some sugar. So I'm just going to do 1 now here, and then shake a little sugar for sweetening. And I generally allow about 2 tablespoonfuls for the tart. So there we have first apple in. We'll just shake some sugar over that. And now we put the second layer on top. A lot of people like cloves in their apple tart, but that's really a personal taste. People, I find, either love or hate cloves. Oh, there's one gone flying. Should we leave it there? We've enough here. So now, fairly even, so that they'll all cook through while the tart is baking. And now there we go. Now we're going to put on our second spoon of sugar. And before I put the top layer on top, just give a little bit for luck there, I brush around the edge with a little cold water. And I have a brush here with some cold water, which we're just going to brush around the edge. And this is to seal the tart, to make sure that the juices remain in the tart and not spilling out onto your oven. That done, we're now going to just roll the pastry up onto the filling, as you see. There we have, just ease it out to the edge, press down well. Just if there's a little loop there, don't worry about it, just gently press it down. Now, having done that, you take your knife and you trim the edge of your pastry right around. Next stage is to seal the edges and form a crust. So you take the back of a knife, you place your finger on the edge of the pastry and you work your way around like that. So you're forming a crust and you're also sealing the pastry well. Now don't worry if the pastry comes in a bit from the edge of the plate, because as you'll see in a minute, we'll be easing it back out with a scalloped edge to the edge of the plate. Gently work your way around to form that crust. Right around. Now, we finally make our scalloped edge, and to do that you take your thumb and you just ease it out, working your way around. Now, just to mention as well that pastry freezes particularly well. Wrap it and into the freezer, it'll keep up to 3 months, so you can make your pastry in advance and then take it out before you want to make your apple tarts, quiches or whatever. So there we have the scallop edge done. Now, to have a nice tart with the pastry down on the apples, it's important that you put a cut on top, and this is simply to allow the steam or the heat to escape. Next stage is to put that into a preheated oven, 400 Fahrenheit, 200 centigrade, gas mark 6. Your oven must be at temperature, and it takes the average domestic oven about 20 minutes to reach that heat. You also put the pastry in to bake in an upper shelf position. So we put one in about 25 minutes ago. That's all it takes for your tart to bake. There it is in the raw stage. We're going to take it out now in the baked stage, I hope. Wow. And here we have our wonderful apple tart. Now that can be served with custard, cream, ice cream, but I think most people prefer it served with a little custard. So I'm just going to cut a wedge from it now. That lovely short, really short biscuity pastry, and that's what it should be like, the shortcrust pastry, short and biscuity. And there we have it. Look at that wonderful apple. And now, just to finish off, we give it a little drizzle of some custard. So there we have our traditional apple tart, a firm favourite with everybody. So enjoy when you bake it.